Hello everyone. We're delighted to have Michaela MacColl at the Concord Bookshop this afternoon. Michaela's new book for young adults, The Revelation of Louisa May, introduces us to teenage Louisa May Alcott as she struggles to support her family and solve a mystery right here in Concord. The book includes such recognizable characters as Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and of course the family that inspired the classic Little Women. The Revelation of Louisa May combines fact from these historical figures' lives with a fictional story that is both captivating and rich in historical detail. There's a villainous slave catcher, a fugitive in need of help, and an unexpected visitor who fill Concord Center with drama and even a little bit of romance. Michaela MacColl has written 2 other literary mysteries about young women writers. Nobody's Secret is about Emily Dickinson, and Always Emily features the Bronte sisters. She's also the author of The Prisoner in the Palace, Promise the Night, and the Hidden Histories series. Michaela's gift for turning real people into beloved heroines shines through in all of her novels. We're excited to hear Michaela talk about and read from The Revelation of Louisa May this afternoon. After the reading, there'll be a break and people can ask questions, and then there'll be time to get books signed as well. We have them here, but there's also some up front there. So now please help me welcome Michaela MacColl and her newest book.
Hi. The book actually doesn't come out until next week, so I've never read it before, so that will be fun. And I'm delighted to be back in Concord because naturally I live in Connecticut, so it was really easy to come up here and do some research. And 2 years ago I was in Amherst doing research for Emily Dickinson, so I love, if I can, to go to the place where a book took place. For me, the setting is as much a character as my people. Particularly with Louisa May Alcott, mainly because of her neighbors, I think, not so much because of the town. She just had such wonderful people around her. These literary mysteries, the idea is that we take a beloved writer, someone like Louisa or Emily Dickinson or the Bronte sisters, and put them in a really approachable story, a mystery. My publisher likes to have a little bit of romance in all my stories. So they marketed me as intrigue and romance, and then they told me. So the book started coming out, intrigue and romance, and I'm like, really? No? And I remember the first time I saw that, I'm like saying to my husband, intrigue and romance? And he's like, yeah, go figure. You? I'm not the most romantic person. But I will say my publisher doesn't care what kind of romance it is. They really don't care if there's a happy ending. And most of the people I write about are sort of confirmed spinsters. You know, my challenge is to introduce a credible romance that is fun and flirty, and not graphic, because I just don't do that, and then break it up by the end. For one reason or another, all my stories, these women end up alone. They have the consolation of having written amazing things that persist till today, but they don't get the boy. So in all of my books so far, and I've written the 4th one as well, I think the love interest has been a murderer, a victim, a cad, and someone who's just too principled to live with. I won't tell you which ones are which. So with Louisa May, when I started to write that, we picked that one because Little Women is so beloved. Yeah, the dog likes it too. Although I think Louisa was more of a cat fan, I have to say. So my challenge when I'm writing these books is to try and find that character. You know, who was Louisa May Alcott, particularly when she was young. When I started with Emily Dickinson, I was playing against type because we all know who Emily Dickinson became. You know, the recluse, the woman in white, the myth of Amherst. So I wanted to take it back to when she was a teenager to show that she wasn't always like that, and to create a fictional reason why possibly she became like that later. So with Louisa, it was really quite easy. So much has been written about her, and she wrote so much. And then she hands me Little Women on a platter. And Little Women is based on her and her family. So I had so much to work with from Jo March, her character, as well as all the biography I read. So that's how I start with these books, is in tandem, I'll read their best-known works while I'm reading biography. Lots and lots of biography. Particularly the more modern biographies, because they're the ones that are looking at more psychological insights. You know, I think biography goes in waves. You know, For a couple decades, it was all social history, and then it was feminism, and now it's revisionism, and now it's more psychological. The best biography I found for writing Louisa was Marmee and Louise, which some of you may know. And I had the pleasure of hearing that author talk about that book. And she's actually a relative of the Alcotts, and some of the book was based on letters she found in her grandmother's attic. It was very cool. But it presented a really compelling version of a girl and her very complicated relationship with her mother and father, particularly her mother. And that mother is Marmee. So I don't know how familiar you are with how Little Women came to be written. Louisa grew up excruciatingly poor, much poorer than the March sisters are in Little Women. Her father was a philosopher, self-taught, never went to college, but he became, a pretty famous educator and a philosopher who really had an aversion to working for money, which made the family encounter an awful lot of poverty. I'm not saying he was lazy, he wasn't. He wrote, he thought, he worked very hard on their house. This book takes place when they lived in Wayside, the Nathaniel Hawthorne house next to the museum. And he basically rebuilt that house from scratch with his bare hands. He farmed it, did it all. So he was not lazy, he just didn't want to work for money, which puts his wife in the rather difficult position of having to beg, borrow from all of her relatives until they can't stand to see the sight of her anymore. I think her brother wrote to her and said, I've noticed that Bronson isn't averse to taking the money that I've worked for. And he never quite made it as a philosopher. He never made it as someone like Emerson or Thoreau who could make money from their work and going on the lecture circuit. I think probably because he skipped over the organized thought part and went straight to speaking well. Apparently he could fill a room and people would pay for the privilege of just hearing him talk. But when he tried to write, even his close friend Ralph Waldo Emerson said, it's pretty confused. It's a little muddled. He doesn't really make the argument he needs to make. So Louisa is growing up with three sisters, her poor mother Marmee, Bronson, who doesn't want to work for money, and even at the age of 12, she has one ambition, and that's to make a lot of money and take care of her family, which is a sort of impressive ambition for a 12-year-old. Even more impressive that she actually made it happen. So at 12, she starts to write. The first thing she wrote that we know about was probably these little books she did for Ralph Waldo Emerson's daughter. And they were little fairy tales, literally fairy tales in the garden. And I think they were quite sweet, but she thought that they were pap, moral pap for children is what she called them. She liked to write what she called blood and thunder stories. So if you remember Little Women, whenever Joe's making up these crazy stories about the missing heir and the long-lost prince and the mistaken heiress, all those stories were what she really liked to do. And she did them very, very well. But she wrote them under a pseudonym because it really wasn't appropriate. Even though they were poor, they still came from a pretty good family for her to write those under her own name. So even now, we're still finding those stories pop up every once in a while. They'll find a cache of old magazines, and they'll go through them, and they're like, oh, this is the writing name that Louisa May Alcott used. So they keep finding new ones. And you read them, and they're so well done. I mean, they're just professional through and through. She knew how to put together a story. But she wasn't getting any recognition under her own name, which was important to her. And then the Civil War comes. In the Civil War, the Alcotts were abolitionists, they were pacifists, really wanted to support the war effort. She ends up going to Washington to be a nurse in a hospital there. And the conditions were brutal. It was just awful. And to keep her spirits up and to sort of process what she was seeing, she wrote these little sketches home. She wrote, little letters. And the people she met, she made them into characters that she told her family about. And she's so good at writing that those characters became real to her family. And when you read them, you mourn when these people die. You really feel the other side of the battle, which is what happens afterwards. Louise ends up getting sick after 6 weeks and has to come home. And she never really quite recovers her health. They think that perhaps she was dosed with mercury. So the heavy metal poisoning, it's the most popular theory of how she died. There's some other theories, but that's the most popular one. When she gets home, everyone says, those sketches, they were really good. Why don't you see if you can't get those published? So she does, and to her great surprise, they are a big success. Not only they're popular, but they're also a critical success. People really, really like them. So now she's writing under her own name, and she's ready to decide what she wants to do. one publisher who knew about her Blood and Thunder stories as well as the sketches says to her, I have this idea. I think there is a market for writing for girls. I'd like you to write a children's story for me. She's like, no, absolutely not. Moral path, won't do it. And he says, oh, please. And they go back and forth, and she just says no. And then he does something that's quite smart. He goes to her father and offers her father a publishing deal if he can convince his daughter to write a book for children. And she can't resist that kind of pressure from the home and without. So she writes Little Women. She's trying to think of a story that's appropriate for kids, and the only thing she can really think about is this period from, I think 12 to 14, here in Concord, living in the Wayside House, when she was pretty happy. It was one of the few times in their family life where they had enough to eat, they were pretty settled, she was pretty happy. She's looking back at that time and she says, I could write about that, I suppose. And she asks her sisters and her mother, do you mind if I write about you guys? And they're like, oh no, of course, do it, that'd be great. So the beginning of Little Women is very anecdotal. I mean, really there's no plot there. It's just, Christmas isn't Christmas without presents. And then you have all these little anecdotes because she was just writing stories as she recalled them. And she wrote really, really fast. I think she did about 200 pages in about 6 weeks, which is amazing when you consider there's no typewriters or word processors. She wrote so fast that she trained herself to write ambidextrously. She could write with her right hand, and then when her right hand got tired, she started with her left hand so she wouldn't have to take a break. And this is dedication. I mean, it takes nothing to get me to get up from my typewriter and wander away. But she really punched through these 200 pages, sends it to the publisher with a cover letter saying, it's dreadfully dull. And he writes back, yeah, it really is. He says, but I gave it to my niece. And she won't stop bugging me about these March girls and what happens to them. So I think maybe there's something there. Why don't you go ahead and finish it? So she does, and it becomes a bestseller, a huge bestseller. Made her the equivalent of a millionaire. So for the rest of her life, she's able to take care of her family in comfort and let her father publish and let Marmee take a rest finally because of Little Women. In fact, when her sister Anne, who is Meg in the novel, when Meg's husband passes away suddenly, leaving 2 little boys, Louisa just jots off Joe's boys and assigns the copyrights to her 2 nephews so that they would be taken care of. She saw these books purely as money makers, and that's what they were to her. She never goes back to the Blood and Thunder stories, which I think she probably always regretted. But it was more important to her to be able to take care of her family. So, she's written a story for me where she's placed herself front and center as the main character, the character we all love. On Facebook, there's all these little contests, which March sister are you? And everyone wants to be Jo. Every writer I know wanted to be Jo. I think Louisa wanted to be Jo. One biographer that really made sense to me wrote about how when Louisa writes Jo, she writes a character who is just like her, stubborn, impetuous, quick to anger, slow to forgive, but instead of being scolded, as Louisa is, she's loved for those faults. And for me, that was the key. That was like, okay, that makes sense to me. I can deal with a character like that. Because not only is she interesting and fun, you feel a tiny bit sorry for her, even though she would have no patience with that whatsoever. In this story, I chose it to place it at a time when she's about 16, and Marmee has decided, because they have no money at all, to take a job in New Hampshire. She's going to run a spa. And this is unheard of for a mom to leave family to go for a job. And Marmee's not happy about it, but she doesn't think, they don't have a choice. From a plot perspective, it's very hard to have Louisa find a body and romance and all the things she's going to get into if Marmee's around. I mean, Marmee, I think, has her finger on the pulse of this family, and Louisa wouldn't be able to get away with half this stuff if Marmee was around. So I need to get Marmee out of there. And as it turns out, this one summer, she was gone. I have a friend who's Patricia Riley Giff, who's a wonderful writer, and she's my writing teacher and mentor. And she says the first thing you have to do when you write for children is get rid of the parents. It's true. Think about every great child book you know. The parents are either not there, they're dead, they're traveling, or they're bad parents. Harry Potter. Were the parents there?
No.
They're dead. I think the kids in the books of Narnia have parents, but we never ever see them because kids can't get into trouble if the parents are around and doing their job. So first thing we do is get rid of the parents. The other thing, the other bit of rule, if you're ever writing for kids, is you cannot kill off the family pet. You can't do it. It's okay to kill off the parents, but not the family pet. So Marmee is leaving, and this leaves all the burdens on the household on Louisa. Her older sister is away teaching. So it's Louisa, and May goes with her mother, and Beth. And Beth, of course, is on the sofa, because Beth is always on the sofa, being an invalid, and her father. And Louisa's reached that point, I think, in every teenage girl's relationship with her father, where he no longer walks on water, where she's beginning to question the choices he's making, particularly since, to her mind, he's driven Marmee away. In the midst of this, a fugitive slave appears, which is not as far-fetched as it seems, because the Alcotts were conductors in the Underground Railroad. There's not a lot of documentation about this, but as it was very secret, and she could have gone to jail for it, you wouldn't expect a lot of documentation. But Louisa does remember, as an older woman, having a slave in their kitchen that they took care of and they hid for a while before he took the next step, heading out to Canada. And wherever you have fugitive slaves, you have slave catchers, and secrets, and blackmail possibilities. So it was really fun to put this little sleepy town into a bit of turmoil for a few days. I'm just going to read a few pages from the beginning, very brief, just to give you a sense of how I do what I do. And notice, when you're dealing with women in the 19th century, it's very hard to give them very active roles, at least at first, because it wouldn't be true to the way they lived. So for Louisa to get any information, she has to do it the old-fashioned way. She has to eavesdrop. Chapter 1. All of my literary mysteries have a little text at the beginning from Little Women. From the author that I'm writing about. It's my way of bridging the gap between this modern book and their work. So the quote here is, "Don't you wish we had the money Papa lost when we were little, Joe? Dear me, how happy and good we'd be if we had no worries." "You're leaving me?" Her father's words floated through the cracks in the door. Louisa stifled a cry. Marmee would never leave them. Through all their suffering, the one constant was that the family must and would stay together. Abandoning her desk, Louisa pressed her ear to the door that led to the parlor. She strained to hear her mother's answer. "Bronson, you've left me no choice." Marmee's voice was tight, as though her vocal cords had been wrung like a wet rag. Louisa opened the door with one finger, just a bit, to see her mother pacing back and forth across the narrow parlor. With a ripple of shock, Louisa noticed that Marmee's dark, gray-streaked hair had come loose from her bun. Louisa stroked one of her own untidy braids in solidarity. "I can't economize any more," Marmee said. "We've used up our credit in every shop in Concord. We can't afford to stay in this house or buy necessaries for the children." Her voice grew stronger, then faded as she paced away from the door. "If you won't work for money, I shall have to. It's a good job. They want me to run the hotel and manage the water cures." Craning her neck, Louisa could make out her father's face, as handsome and stubborn as ever. But his voice shook as he said, "It's so far. Waterford is 150 miles away. What if the children need you?" Father was reclining on the comfortable sofa, his hands interlaced behind his gray, streaked blonde head, his long legs stretched out in front of him. But his indifference was a pose. He would be lost without Marmee. They all would be. "What the children need is to go to school," Marmee said, "but we can't afford it." "Pah! What better teachers could they have besides me, Emerson, and Thoreau?" he asked with his usual confidence. "Millionaires would pay a fortune for their children to have such an education. But their education, such as it is, lacks method and discipline." "All the better!" Bronson exclaimed. "You know my methods. Our children thrive without the confines of a schoolroom and a harsh schoolmaster. Anna's only 17 and she has to work from her living far from home. And what about Louisa? She should be going to parties and enjoying herself as I did when I was her age." Poor Marmee. Her voice was so tired and discouraged. "When I was their age, I was working on the farm," Bronson argued. "But I enjoyed Boston's finest society, going to theater and parties. I want the girls to have some fun in their lives." Huddled against the door, Louisa slid down to the floor and sighed. She definitely would prefer the theater to working for a living. Louisa knew she should find a job like Anna had, but she hated teaching and selling and all the respectable ways that she could earn money. And anything that pulled her away from writing her stories and poems was a waste of her time. I'm happy to talk about anything having to do with Louisa or my books. So if anyone has any questions, I would love to hear them, and we can chat.
I have a question.
Thank
Actually
you.
have one.
I planted her in the audience.
Well, this is the question that actually came up in my mind while I was reading. When you're choosing very real, very recognizable characters to write about, do you ever find yourself fictionalizing their lives too far and like wondering if you have to pull back, like especially with Thoreau and Emerson, who people are very attached to their every moment. Where do you sort of draw the line of what you're not going to fictionalize anymore?
I haven't hit it yet, that line.
Okay.
It's a good question because with my other books, I was dealing with very isolated lives that these women had. You know, there's no one that anyone recognizes that grew up with the Brontes, except the Brontes. So I could work from their biography. And I was a little nervous about playing with Thoreau and Emerson. I mean, they are deservedly beloved. But the beautiful part about historical fiction is that you can work off a rumor, a potential scandal. People whispered that maybe Thoreau was too close to Emerson's wife. You know, it doesn't really matter if it's true or not. For my purposes, I can use it. All my books have a very elaborate author's note at the back where I talk about what's true and what's not, and what isn't provable. So hopefully I redeem her reputation. But it's fiction, you know? So I get to play with that if I want to. I will not push them to a place where I don't believe it's credible. You know, I'm not going to have, you know, Emerson suddenly break down in disco. You know, it just wouldn't happen. I can't really have them take off for California if they didn't go. You know, I work within the scaffold of what we know to be true, and then I weave a story through it. And I get to play. I mean, I originally got a degree in Russian history, and a master's degree, and I discovered that to keep going for my PhD would mean I couldn't play anymore, that everything had to be documented and backed up to the last time, and it was so boring. It's so much more fun to think of what if, you know, and to play with these really interesting characters and say, what would she do if she were confronted with the body? What if her father is a suspect? You know, what if her best friend, Henry David Thoreau, is suspected of murder? You know, what would that be like? So I play, and then I use my author's note as my parachute at the back to explain what's true and what's not. Did you get as far as the author's note?
Oh yeah.
Okay, there we go. Yes.
Curiosity. I think you just said this. I don't think you were actually meant to say this. I think you're just joking a little bit. But you said you're easily distracted away from your typewriter.
Oh yes.
Do you really need a typewriter? Or do you actually use a computer? Or do you use a computer?
Oh, no, I use a computer.
Okay. I thought maybe there was some.
No, I do have
you're creating something.
an old keyboard that came with my first IBM PC, and at the time they were just bridging the gap. This will mean nothing to you guys. You probably don't even know what typewriters are. But this first keyboard I had, they were modeling it off the IBM Selectric, which was a great typewriter. You felt that when you typed. So this keyboard that I have, which I have to keep getting new and different connectors so it will work on my new computers, feels like a typewriter, and it makes that happy noise. But no, I don't use a typewriter.
But you can still. That's interesting that you can still do that. You still have a keyboard that mimics.
Yes.
That's neat.
I have a friend who's a graphic artist, and one of her, she's an artist who uses words as well as graphics, and she's got a series where she takes old typewriters, the old kind, you know, with the manual ones, and she replaced all the keys with shards of glass pointing straight up, and called it writer's block. Yeah, it's one of my favorites. Yeah.
So you don't live in Concord? You live
No, I live in Connecticut.
in Connecticut. And how long did you spend in Concord?
Oh, a couple days.
Yeah.
The beauty about writing about people like I write about right now is that so much work has been done.
Yeah.
You know, I came to tour the house, to tour Emerson's house, because a lot happens in his house, and to get a feel for the town. But really, most of the details I need, I can get from books. Which is good for me, because my publisher expects me to put one of these out a year. You know, That's been a little tricky. I did not have time to go to Yorkshire when I was writing about the Bronte sisters, which was a bummer because I would have loved to have gone there. But a lot of my story takes place on the moors, as those sisters were wont to be wandering along those moors. And I found there are people in England who are such walkers that they film and record every step of their walk along the Bronte paths. So they're like, oh yeah, here you can see heading down this hill, there's lots of loose rock, be careful. I'm like, all right, so Emily, is running down the hill and she's slipping, because I was able to get that. I don't know how I would have done these so quickly without the internet and without the body of work that these women have engendered. Yes.
What's the favorite book you've written? What's your favorite book you've written?
It's like asking which one is my favorite kid. It really depends on the day. There's a mother who laughed at that one. When I'm writing a particular book, I get really interested in what I'm doing. And it's all I can think about. And somehow the New York Times crossword always agrees with me. If I'm writing about the Alcotts, it's going to be Alcott clues all year long. And then I'm on to the next project, and then the Alcotts sort of fade. And I'm doing the fourth one of the series, and it's Jane Austen. So now it's all Jane Austen, all the time. I'm also writing a series of books that are more pure historical fiction, where I'm not writing about famous people, I'm writing about famous events and putting kids in those situations. And I thought that would be easier because I wouldn't be constrained by the biographical facts the way I am with these writers. But it turned out to be much harder to make people up from scratch. I had a really hard time with it. And then when I came back to the literary mysteries, it was like putting on soft, fluffy slippers and a big fuzzy robe. It was just so easy and so comfortable. So right now it's probably my Jane Austen book, because that's new. And that'll come out next year.
Yes. I think you just sort of answered my question. I was going to say, do you ever kind of dream about breaking out into complete fiction, or do you enjoy the constraints of having the guidelines of history?
For me, what I love about historical fiction is that moment when your reader realizes that the really cool part is the true part. That's my favorite thing, especially with kids, when they sit there and say, oh, that part was true? I wrote a book about Beryl Markham, the aviator, and her childhood in Africa. And it's called Promise the Night, and it's about her growing up in Africa, and it's interspersed with her exploits as an aviator. And I remember I got this one review from Kirkus, that liked the book, except that they really felt that it was very far-fetched, that all these things, they made a list of all these things they thought were far-fetched. Like, she really wouldn't have gone out on a lion hunt, she wouldn't have been mauled, she wouldn't have gone... And I'm looking at it like, dude, all that was true. I had a hard time keeping up with my character and creating a story around what we knew that was as exciting as her real life. So I love that part. However, my editor is sort of thinking the way you are. Maybe we should branch out and maybe step away from literary mysteries and try something new that's more popular, that has a more popular appeal. And then I go to a librarians association, and I'll tell you, they love these books. Because for them, it's a way to introduce kids to the writers. If they already love Little Women, then they're probably going to enjoy learning about Louisa May Alcott. But if they won't pick up Little Women because it's 140 years old or whatever it is, maybe if we hook them on Louisa, who's a very cool character, they're like, oh, yeah, maybe the next step is to read Little Women or to come to Concord. Anything else? I can chat all day about this. Yes?
Could you tell us how you became a writer?
Oh, wow. I only started seriously writing when my kids were about 5 and 3. And my husband and I had been living in Europe, and we were traveling a lot in Europe. And I'm the person with the guidebook. That person who always has the guidebook in every party. There's one, and no one likes to listen to her. And I found how hard it was. We were in wonderful places like Florence and San Gimignano, and there was no stories to hook the kids on the places where we were. So that's how I started thinking about writing. That I'd like to write stories that took place, in the history of these wonderful places, to encourage them to look at the place with a different view. So literally the first thing I started writing was a big Renaissance book about Michelangelo, which is, in retrospect, ridiculously ambitious. And I haven't been able to sell it yet, but I'm working on it. And from there, I ended up writing my Victorian novel, and that was about, it's called Prisoners in the Palace, and it's about Queen Victoria as a teenager. And I started writing that right after The Other Boleyn Girl was so popular. And an editor I met had been interested in those kinds of books, but for teens. So taking it down, making it cleaner, a little more approachable for kids. And we did it with Queen Victoria, which was odd, not the sexiest of queens. But it was a fun story to write. And that was where I began. That came out in 2010, and since then I've written 7 books. So I've been lucky. I found 2 editors that really like the way I write. And I have to say the Common Core curriculum is very good for me. Because the Common Core, for everything else you may say about it, at its heart as a learning tool is all about making kids connect between fact, fiction, the original sources I use. So the more my books can do that, the happier teachers and librarians seem to be with them. So, but it's pretty recent. I mean, my oldest just went to college, so it's only been about 10 years. I know people have been writing a lot longer. Yes?
Are you on school curriculum's reading lists?
Sometimes. Right now, I don't think the publishers have really figured out, those lists are actually very restricted. And it's like one book gets on the list, and then they all have to buy that book. So I think the publishers are trying to crack that. The way we do approach it is by the state reading lists. I don't know what Massachusetts is, but in Connecticut it's the nutmeg. I was just in Texas, and it's the bluebonnet list there. Texans buy a ton of books. They're very conservative about the books they choose, but if you hit one of their lists, you make a lot of sales. And those state lists, do you know about them yet? The state lists tend to go with like reading programs where the kids will read, they have a choice of like 12 books, and they ask them to vote at the end, and then the top ones win the prize. But to get on the list means that every school and bookstore and library has multiple copies. Does Massachusetts have one? Really? Okay. It's a big deal in Connecticut, and if we get on the state list, that's where we have a chance of breaking into curriculum, because that makes the librarians take a look at it, and then they make the recommendations to the curriculum. But it's a changing world.
Yeah.
We do have books for sale up front, and we can sign. I'll set up a little signing place here if people want to get their books personalized or anything.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you so
I'm
much.
really grateful you came out on a Sunday afternoon.